Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Shon Lyublanovits, the program lead for cyber supply chain risk management at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. Hey, Shon, thanks for joining the program.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Of course, our focus today is supply chain. And so I'd love to know a little bit more about this relatively new effort that you're leading at CISA to establish a cyber supply chain risk management office. How is that going? Where are you at?
Yeah, it's great. The timing for this is perfect. We are just coming up on 1 year of really thinking and reshaping how CISA is helping agencies and just the nation in general respond to the threats associated with supply chain. Having the opportunity to come over and support this agency has been such a thrill for me. CISA is such a unique agency, and we're in a unique position to really help lead the charge in really thinking differently about cyber supply chain risk management. We've evolved from this idea of there's this balloon in the sky that we're grabbing, but now that we've got that balloon, what do we do with it? How do we really help agencies operationalize it? So we've been, laying some really good building blocks and really trying to get the word out. So I really do appreciate opportunities like this to talk about our work, to talk about how we're thinking about moving forward in this space and just how we're helping the nation move forward.
And you came to this job with a background in these issues, of course. What's your previous experience with C-SCRM that you're bringing to CISA?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just attending a meeting. I started in this area where no one really knew how to spell scrim. And I always say that very facetiously, but something happened, about 12 or 13 years ago that made me go, I really need to start paying attention and understanding what supply chain is. And I think the crux of it really was as we started to move towards more cloud-based solutions and cloud-based initiatives, supply chain kept kind of creeping up. And, with the software and with the technology that we use, particularly our laptops and our phones at the time, we knew we needed to learn and understand a little bit more about provenance, where these things actually came from in the actual supply chain. And so I'll date myself and go back to Executive Order 13636 that talked about improving cybersecurity through acquisitions. When I was at GSA, I connected the dots. And I really made it my mission, one, to understand myself, what it meant for the agencies, but to really bring the right people to the table internally to the agency, but also externally, like your NIST and DODs of the world, so that we could start to have the conversation of understanding what supply chain meant to the government and how we could start to tackle that. So in the early days, our focus was on really acquisition language and really figuring out what we could add in those contracts. What could we hold our vendor community accountable towards when it came to supply chain? And now it's evolving, right? Now we're really thinking about the cyber part of supply chain risk management, which of course brings me to CISA.
What are your goals with the C-SCRM office at CISA? And, more generally, what does the C-SCRM program office look like? How many folks do you have working for you? What's kind of the contours of this office?
So, my vision really is to continue to advocate and spread the message that this has to be a top priority in all agencies at all times. And I really want to help agencies figure out sort of the 1, 2, 3, 4s of supply chain risk management implementations. What does that look like, right? Who do I need to talk to? How do I make it work? And how am I proving success? And what that's going to look like for CISA is really answering some tough questions that my leadership is really challenging me to think about. How do we strategically put that message out? what are some of the things that we must do internally as CISA that would best position us to help other agencies? So I'm spending a lot of time with my team, really thinking about what does the inside of CISA look like? Who's working on supply chain and how do we come together? You know, a really big part of what we think about is NRMC, right? How does the National Risk Management Center fit into the work that I'm doing? How does that fit into vulnerability management when we're thinking about critical software and SBOM? So we're having a lot of internal conversations to really think better and make ourselves stronger as we continue to sort of shine that light outwards to industry, to the ICT community through NRMC, to our vendors that are working really closely right now on some software projects with VM, and to my team and agencies really focusing on the federal civilian executive branch to really help them figure this thing out. And so when it comes to my team, we're still growing and we're building, right? So as we continue to develop our own strategic plan and strategy, we're able to sort of have those conversations with our leadership team to build out. But structurally right now, there are three very important areas of my PMO. I have a strategy and governance group that really is helping to shape and think about what I just talked about, Justin. It also is developing metrics and KPIs, right? We can't just do work to be doing work. We need to show value and success. We've got our Sigma team that is really the bulk and the heart of our FAST work, the Federal Acquisition Security Council, which has been codified into law for another 10 years. So we've got to think holistically, how are we bringing other parts and members together to really think about removal and exclusion orders? And the last piece is my Storm team, which really is my outward-facing team that is working boots to ground with agencies to develop best practice guides, to talk about training. So we kind of look at ourselves as this awesome sort of triad that's bringing the best and brightest in this space to really, again, focus internally on CISA, but to shine that externally and help by other agencies.
Wow, yeah, it sounds like there's been a lot of work in just a year to really put some structure behind this C-SCRM effort and, of course, Program Management Office. Let's start with, I guess, what that strategy and governance group might be working on around metrics and KPIs, because I wanted to ask you about best practices for federal agencies, and I'm guessing there's some interplay there. So, what does success look like? How do you show value through a C-SCRM program in the federal government?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we are working on in FY24 is developing a maturity model. So what we want to do is actually put some framing, some levels around different maturations in supply chain, right? So that way we can go in and say, if an agency is at a 0, do we want to get them to a 1 or a 2 based on their mission and function area? And in order to get to level 2, we want to put together these 4 or 5 things. And so if we can actually show that we've helped agencies accomplish putting governance documents in place, having a communications plan, right? If the next SolarWinds happens, I always ask agencies, do you know who to talk to in your agency, much less outside? So really putting some structure around getting some champions internally, getting leadership on board. There's a different conversation that we need to have with our leadership about supply chain and being able to articulate not only the fact that we need to do it, but what value will it bring to the agencies? What goals am I helping to accomplish by actually doing this work? And so putting a little bit of framing and structure around that is important for us as we move forward. Looking at some key themes, right? So if I am continuing to see risk and threats happening in the telecom space, then maybe I need to look at those telecom providers. Maybe I need to look at those contracts and see how they're structured. So just having more awareness, situational awareness about what's going on in the threat landscape and being able to respond to that, and having some documentation, some metrics that says, here's what's happened, but here's how we're mitigating that.
Got it. And, what does that conversation with leadership look like? How do you, either if you're from the bottom, convince leadership to get on board if you think this is an important issue, or, for leaders, maybe the CISO or whatever, how do you maybe work across your organization to make this a priority?
So that's a really great question. And it's almost like finding out that love language, right? What matters to your boss? Is it making sure that we understand our mission? Is it identifying our high value assets? Is it understanding that we're a critical infrastructure type agency that supplies X? Understand what matters to them and communicate your C-SCRM through that, right? We have a lot of guidance coming out from our broader CSD area that talks about agency priority goals. So I need to make sure that my work that I really want to do is tied to those priority goals. How do I fit into that broader vision? So to the practitioners that are really having challenges meeting at the right playing field for your leadership, start to look at those agency goals. Look at your mission priorities and really make sure that that work is tied to that and is matching.
I also wanted to ask you about training, which it sounds like it's being led by the Storm team, I think you mentioned. How is your program office developing training and, skills for what the federal civilian executive branch will need in this space?
And going back to the early days of C-SCRM, I've been able to scrape my knees and really understand where the pain points were, both from the acquisition side, but also on the technology side. And what I understood more than anything was that we didn't have sort of this pathway that allowed us to mature from foundational knowledge to sort of that subject matter trainer expertise. And so ARMOR, which is advancing cyber risk management through operational resilience, really allows us to take a layperson. I always use the analogy that a janitor needs basic C-SCRM knowledge, taking that person straight out of college and saying, let me give you sort of the principles of what C-SCRM is, and allowing a person to continue to gain additional knowledge from the steward to the champion to the resilience badge and to the maestro. Of course, I spelled scrim in that, if you didn't catch that, Justin. But we've got these different badges that will literally help a person mature their knowledge base. So that doesn't just help a person that's actually doing the work, that helps leadership, because we're always having new people stepping into these roles, and we need a place where we can say, start here, right, to increase your knowledge, your skill set, and your awareness. So this is something that CISA is going to latch on to and take on to really help agencies figure this out. But our goal at some point is to get this out to the SLTT community, to get this into schools, right? So that we've got a strong workforce coming into the federal government, understanding what supply chain is, but actually being able to start to do some work into that. So we are starting with the steward training. I'm working with my team, my leadership team, to really make sure that that thing is baked as best that we can, the temperature is right. And then we're going to do some limited piloting rolling into the next calendar year. And then we'll do broader releases of that training. And then we'll work on the next one, which is the champion. So our goal is to continue to up the ante as we move through this progression, to really help give people a place to go to get knowledge and awareness in this space.
Very interesting. And I'm glad you spelled that out for me. Sometimes I need but that's a really great approach and a good way to help people latch on to it, I guess. In terms of the piloting, is that's something that federal agencies will be doing? Are you kind of working?
Yeah, we've got a few select agencies that we're going to have come in and pilot it. tell us where there are opportunities for us to improve right before we do a broader release. So we're excited for that.
And will these generally be, folks who are working in acquisitions, folks who are working in the CISO or CIO office who are doing this initial pilot? How's that?
So it's going to be diverse, because I also want to have a person that has had no experience in this space come in to look at it clean and provide some honest feedback. So we're going to make sure that we make it as wide and diverse as we can in the knowledge base.
Got it. And at a ground level, what are the basic SCRM skills that folks need to know? Not asking you to give away, the specific training just yet, but what are some of the basics that folks need to know about SCRM skills, mindset, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We all learned through the pandemic that there's an actual chain, right? There's a process to get the things that we use and consume every day. And so having a general understanding that there's a thought process, there's a creation of, I want to create X, and understanding that there is a manufacturer and there is a delivery driver and there is the QA person, right, in that process that can become broken. What happens if I swap out the QA person and we let some bad products get into our day-to-day environment, what that looks like? So really understanding, one, there is a chain to supply and demand. And two, what do I do? What can I do to protect that? So am I understanding better what's in a contract? Am I understanding better that I need to read labels and really understand, if I'm going to use some code, I want to understand what type of code it is, what the ingredient list is for that code that I'm using, right? Understanding that every piece of technology that we have, from our refrigerators to our phones, have components in them that can allow bad things to happen, right? So understanding how bad things happen and what are the simple things we can do to sort of reduce those risks. But as we move a little bit further, being able to have real conversations with leadership and being able to pull people together. How do I pull a person on the other side of the world that I've never met, that's part of my organization, into a conversation about supply chain, right? So how do I make it matter to them? And so really giving, our team, our practitioners, those simple tools to say, hey, have a brown bag month once a month to look at the latest guidance that came out. And that way you can kind of hear and get feedback, those simple things, As a janitor, don't let someone come in that hasn't swiped their badge. Hey, should you be the one working on that HVAC system? Can I see proof of that? So those simple things that we aren't necessarily thinking about in our day-to-day help support our supply chain.
Got it. Yeah, and so much of that comes down to the cybersecurity side of the mission when you're talking about code, and whether you're using vulnerable code or code that you're not quite sure where it's from, or identity and access management kind of plays into that last example. It's interesting, the different threads and overlap here. It seems as if acquisition is where a lot of the supply chain risk management rubber hits the road, though. And you talked about how previously a lot of your early experience is figuring out what kind of accountability can you gain from the vendor community. Where do you think that conversation is today in government, specific to the C-SCRM topic?
So I always say it starts and ends with an acquisition, right? Whether it's to procure it or to end it. One of the things that we did, right, was take the acquisition lifecycle and actually start to point in where you need to have security considerations. And so continuing to pull the acquisition folks into a room and talk about how hard it is to change FAR clauses, right? I think sometimes as IT people, we think you just mark it out, right? It's over and done because you marked it out. But no, there's a process to actually go in and change a clause in the FAR, or to think about, the GSAM and what's in that, or understanding that if a vendor is not performing to your expectation, there's guidance that you can actually use to hold them accountable. We forget those things. So I think continuing to pull the acquisition community and the IT people together so that we can talk about what matters to each side, right? And figuring out a good path to move forward is going to be key. The days are over where it was like, the IT people does their own thing and the acquisition does theirs. We've got to do this together.
And just a quick follow-up, you talked about that acquisition life cycle. Is that something where you have to take into the security considerations? Is that something that CISA is now pushing out to acquisition offices across government, or what's that product?
Well, it's a couple of things. One, there is more of that internal conversation. We work very closely with our acquisition executive. If he's speaking about something that has a supply chain element, we tag up, right? And we talk about, Shon, tell me what you're saying. Here's what I'm hoping to talk about. Do those two things line up? So one, we are having more conversations internally. We are also involved with like the FAR technology team, the actual people that are creating the FAR. As technology and cyber people, we are able to get in and say, here's where you need to add in some supply chain language. And so they'll give us feedback. Well, okay, we can add it, but we've got to consider X. And so having more of those seats at the table to talk about the equities that affect not only supply chain, but cybersecurity and how they go together are important. And we're doing those in things like, M2218, AKA M2316, as we're thinking about, secure software attestations. How do we pull those two things together? How do we influence the FAR so that when we are ready to move forward with our side of the house, it will match what we can hold a law in the FAR?
Got it. And that's a great bridge to the next piece of our conversation. But first, we're going to take a quick pause to break for an industry perspective on the Cyber Leaders Exchange. Back now to Tom in the studio.